ever heard about function in music? What the heck is function? What are we talking about here? Function really comes down to the relationship between the notes of a scale or key and the relationship from individual notes back to tonic, or the home bass note of the key. That home bass note is the note that we're trying to get back to all the time. It's the note that every other note pulls towards and wants to go back to. Now, the path that each note takes to get back to tonic, to get back to do, that's what we talk about when we're talking about function. So if we just start with a scale, any scale, I could play you a major scale like this. And I'm sure you can tell me what home bass is. If you thought or this, then you'd be correct. This is a G major scale, and that G is our home bass. It's the tonic, it's the root of this scale. That's going to be the strongest function because we're always trying to get back to it. We can always recognize that this is the tonic. This is our home bass. This is what we're trying to get back to. Now, if we look at each individual note of the scale, each note is going to have a different pull or a different path it wants to take to eventually get back to do. It's eventually going to want to go back to the tonic. So, for example, if I were to take this scale again, and I stop right there, you're probably going crazy in your head because you really want it to resolve back to tonic. You want to hear that do at the end of the scale. Well, that seventh scale degree is called T, or the leading tone. And that leading tone has a really, really strong pull to go back to do. It probably has the strongest pull back to do of any of the other scale degrees. I could also start at the top of the scale and go back down. And again, if I just stop there, you really want to hear that tonic. You want to hear tonic right there. So re, or the second scale degree, also has a pretty strong pull to go back down to your tonic. Now, the other notes in the scale are going to also have some sort of pull to go back to tonic, but it's not always going to be as strong as those two notes. The seventh scale degree and the second scale degree are definitely the strongest pull back to tonic. But the 5 also has a pretty strong pull back to tonic as well. If I go, here's my 5th scale degree, and it wants to jump up to the tonic there. The 5th scale degree is also known as the dominant. That dominant also really wants to go back to tonic, but it doesn't always go back to tonic. It's an interesting note of the scale because it is kind of stable on its own. If I were to play a scale or a song in a certain key and ask you what home bass is, you'll probably tell me tonic. You'll probably say, yeah, it's do, it's the root. But a lot of times people will hear the 5th scale degree as home bass instead of the root or the tonic of the scale. The 4th scale degree is kind of interesting because it has a half step down to the 3rd scale degree. So if I were to play that G major scale again, that mi to fa is just a half step. And so that fa often wants to pull back to mi before it jumps down to do again. It wants to go from 4 to 3 and then back to 1. So a lot of times we use that in suspensions and other sorts of contexts to pull us back into do and give us a really nice resolution. So we've talked about most of the scale degrees now. We've talked about the tonic. We've talked about the supertonic, or the 2nd scale degree. We've talked about fa, or the predominant scale degree, the 4th scale degree. We've also talked about so, or the 5th scale degree, the 7th scale degree, or the leading tone, and then of course back to tonic again. But we haven't talked about the 3rd scale degree, or the mediant, and we haven't talked about the 6th scale degree, or the submediant. Now the mediant, because it's part of this tonic triad, it really wants to just jump back down to do. It doesn't need to go through anything else to get there. It just falls back down to do. That's kind of its function. The 6th scale degree really wants to go back to do by going through the leading tone. So if I start on the 6th scale degree like this, it wants to go la, ti, do, or 4, 6, 7, and then back to your tonic. If we turn these scale degrees into chords, we're going to get a similar feel. All of these different chords are now going to have similar functions to what the scale degrees have. So if we turn these scale degrees into chords now, each chord built on the scale degree is going to have a similar function to what the scale degree has that it's built off of. So a triad that's built off of the tonic is going to have the same function as the tonic of the scale, the first scale degree. It's going to feel like home bass. The triad built on the fifth scale degree, or the dominant scale degree, is going to have a strong pull back to tonic, but it's also going to feel kind of stable by itself. The triad built off of the seventh scale degree is going to be a diminished chord, so it's definitely going to be unstable and need to resolve somewhere. It kind of acts as a substitute dominant, where it really wants to pull back to tonic again. The triad built off the fourth scale degree is called the predominant, and it kind of shares that function with the 2 chord as well. So the supertonic, when you turn that into a triad, it becomes a minor triad that kind of shares that same function as the predominant function built off of the fourth scale degree. Those predominant chords really like to go to the dominant chords. So if we go from a 4 or a 2 and then go to a 5, then we can resolve it to a 1, and it's going to feel really nice. Now again, notice we haven't talked about the 3 or the 6 at all. They're kind of ambiguous chords. The 6 chord can substitute as a tonic chord sometimes. So for example, if I were to play you a 1 going to a 4, and then I go to a 5, but then instead of resolving it back to a 1, if I go from a 5 to a 6, it still kind of works. That 6 can substitute for the 1. It's not going to be as satisfying of a resolution as a 1 would be. Notice I haven't said anything about the 3. The 3 is an interesting chord. It doesn't get used a whole lot. It kind of has an ambiguous feel to it. It doesn't really substitute as a 1 very well, but it also doesn't really work as a dominant. It can be used as a very weak predominant chord. So I could do something like this, where I take a 1 and then move it to a 3 and then go to a predominant like a 4 and then go to a 5. And then eventually I can move it back to our 1. Now, just because the 3 doesn't get used a whole lot, I wouldn't discount it. It can create some really interesting harmonies. And if you're into creating your own chord progressions and composing songs, I would maybe experiment a little bit with it and see where you can use it. It's very ambiguous, and so it can fit in a lot of different places. Just be careful with how you're using it. Okay, so now that you understand the concept of function and how it works within tonal music, and how each chord and each note brings us back to tonic, then you can start listening for that in the music that you listen to, because most of the music we listen to is going to use these functions to create that harmonic progression that creates the foundation of the song. If this is something that's interesting to you, be sure to check out my next video where we talk about listening for these chord progressions and being able to recognize which chords are being used when you're listening to a piece of music. And be sure to subscribe if you want more music theory pro tips.